אנחנו רצים? Running. Okay. Radiofonico drammatico programma del musica classica. What is the first piece of music you would like to perform on our program?
Janet Jackson?
No, but it's a program of Oriental music. It's not.
You got me there.
Okay. So we'll change our program, no problem. In this case, you started telling us something about your new show. What was it? A Look Over the Bridge, wasn't it?
Yes.
No, The Death of the Salesman.
Yes.
Yes. So
it's a good one.
could you tell us something about the character of Lohman?
Willie Lohman, he's a very sympathetic character that I created out of this gentleman that used to live next door to me, and who was a salesman himself, and he was always trying to make his life work and get his business going. And
hello, Tsuka, the literary editor of the project has just arrived, and this is Eleonora, Janine.
Hi, Janine. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Thanks.
And we're just rehearsing the interview for tomorrow. And I forgot what was.
Who's Mr. Miller?
Me.
She is Mr. Miller.
Okay, you interviewed her.
מה, אפשר להפסיק? אוקיי.
It was a big shock when it went to a nickel. I remember that. It was, I think, right after the war. 49, 50. It was, I think, 10 cents on Sunday. Something like that.
But I remember when you could buy a theater ticket for $1.25 and sit in the second balcony. I mean, that's... Now it's up to 100. Not second balcony, but there is no second balcony.
I was talking to Pete Gurney the other day, and reminding him that if I'd written The Crucible today, it would never have gotten on.
Mm-hmm.
Too many people. Or even a salesman.
That's right.
Because if you saw the lineup of people while taking a bow at the end of Salesman, over 20 people.
Well, it might have gotten on, but it would have been off-Broadway. I mean, like Carol Churchill's new play has they're minor actors, but a cast of 20 or 30. But for short run off-Broadway, you could still get away with it. Your newest work, Arthur, is not a play. It's a short story called The Bear Manuscript, which appeared recently in the New Yorker magazine. And it stirred lots of questions that I had. For one thing, the subject was quite an interesting one. Basically, and you can interrupt me and say it otherwise, but it's about a man who's facing, an artist who's facing writer's block and his special way of curing this writer's block. Could you talk about the story a bit, to explain what it is to you?
Well, the story is that of a writer who has been very successful for a little while in his early career, and then his inspiration died, and he's getting desperate, and he one day conceives that if he could write on the body of a woman, it would all return his fire. And he puts an ad in the Village Voice and gets a woman who is willing to do this. And he writes a story on her back and her thighs and the front. And he's very excited by it. It starts him pumping again. And this is the bare bones of the story, of course. He ends by making love to her in the shower, where he's scrubbing her the words off because he doesn't want, he's not ready to publish yet, and he doesn't want her walking around with his story.
The original manuscript is in fact the body of the woman.
She's the manuscript. And he finds that he gets a glimpse of the idea that what he's got to have is some love in him in order to write. And this has brought out that thought. He's not in love with this woman, but he has sex with her. And the shock of that recognition is the end of the story.
What symbolism should we or should we not read into it? I mean, is it...
I've been wondering about that myself.
Woman as muse, is that part of it or not?
I think so. That's part of it. That the woman, he's writing for a woman, and now he's estranged from his wife, this man. They live together, but they're out of love. And she's lost her youth and is quite depressed. So he can't quite use her anymore as that inspiration. And that may be part of the symbolism.
The story does flash back to the marriage. I thought one of the more interesting characters was the wife's mother, who actually tells the hero of the story, the protagonist, not to marry her daughter. She knows it's going to be trouble. It's not going to be a happy marriage. I must say, as I read that, I suddenly thought, well, is there any connection, any parallel to your first marriage? Is there any autobiographical element in this?
Not really. That's based on a different woman completely. No, my first mother-in-law was divided about me. She was a devout Catholic, and so I being Jewish, she wouldn't have approved of it, but she liked me anyway. And she sensed that this wasn't a bad idea. But she has nothing to do with the story. That woman in the story is a Polish woman, which is what I made her in the story. And I was basically reporting an actual woman who once lived in Connecticut, up in a mill town.
The story also does flash back to the artist's early life and the growing up, the brother and sister with the father, in fact, who's abusive, physically abusive, I guess, as well as emotionally abusive.
But that has nothing to do with me either.
Well, again, I just wanted to clear the
my father was a very kind man, and this father in this story is a brute. He's almost bestial.
Well, what he does to the children, I thought, was just beyond the pale.
Yeah. Well, it's a completely different person than me.
Yeah.
Not everything is autobiographical, you know. This has really nothing to do with my biography.
Well, that's very interesting, because I mean, so many of your plays, either overtly or in most cases quite subtly, do deal with the autobiography, or at least there are elements there that one can trace, where this clearly, as you say,
I think it's a question of maybe of getting older, where the need to illuminate one's own life dims, and you you feel it's not very interesting anymore, and so you begin looking at life quite dispassionately, I find. There's an enormous amount of repetition in my view of life. And so there's a kind of distance that I think I have arrived at, not by any act of will or program. It's just that's the way it is.
In other words, the plays have become less autobiographical as years have gone by.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, as this character writes the story, his story on her body, there was one quote I did write down. You say, astonished, he saw with clarity fragments of days of his youth and young manhood, and arcing over them like a rainbow, his unquestioning faith in life and its all but forgotten promise. And I wonder whether that seems to come straight from the heart, I would say. But
Yeah, well, when came straight from my heart, certainly, but it's not a. I was really writing about that guy, to tell you the truth.
okay.
Because on the whole, I feel I've more or less achieved what I would set out to do.
Well, that's the question I want to raise, in fact,
Yeah.
what it leads to.
It's, with all my limitations, I feel that I really went after the big whale,
Moby Dick?
Moby Dick. And he doesn't, this character.
Mm-hmm.
So if I failed at something that I really threw myself into, not something that I designed from a distance. I threatened myself many times in the course of my life.
How-
I endangered myself.
How so? Could you explain that?
Well, I've written, you know, when I wrote about the salesman, it was a time when the country was very defensive about itself. The anti-communist thing was started, and here I was dealing with a businessman who was a failure. And in fact, Gene Dalrymple, who was a producer in those days, walked out of the theater and said, "That's a time bomb under capitalism," which I hoped it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of capitalism. And that was that kind of a challenge. And with the Crucible, likewise, the gale was running very high, and after all, I think I challenged it, and so on.
Mm.
And all my sons, too. All through the war, everybody knew that a lot of people were illicitly making fortunes out of that war. But nobody was saying anything about it.
Mm.
Occasionally somebody'd get arrested, but very rarely for falsification of one kind or another, the business people. And on the whole, we were one happy family. And all my sons disrupted that idea, to say the least. They challenged it. So I think I can look back and feel some satisfaction.
Was there a single point, though, when you decided you'd go after that whale? When you?
It was way from the beginning, almost. I was inspired by Ibsen in the beginning, because in part, apart from the poetry in his plays, the structure of his plays, I felt he was a conscience of his time. And, but I felt that way about Chekhov, too. After all, not everybody gets into an open droshky and drives across Russia in the snow to see how the political prisoners are doing in Sakhalin Island,
Mm-hmm.
off the coast of Russia. So I had a heroic sort of a background in terms of my ideals.
Before you actually started writing, or
No,
what is
when
this?
I
When you
began.
began. Mm-hmm.
I began by writing a completely autobiographical play about my family.
Labor relations in a company like your father's.
Yeah, it was right in the middle of the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the the first and I thought the last time that I would deal with my family. I soon got on to other subjects, though. And the point of this moment is that I do, unlike the character in that story, who has evaded his own experience, I largely try to confront mine, I think.
Confront the experience and then write about it.
Yeah.
And that happened sometime after that very first play. Well, was All My Sons then a major turning point?
That's right.
Yeah.
The first play was I wrote it in a week as a student in Ann Arbor. And it was what I knew. I knew about that family, and I was really listening to that family. But I soon got tired of that, to tell you the truth. And I wrote a play about which is a totally unknown play because it never was produced. The largest prison in the United States was in Jackson, Michigan. 8,200 prisoners. Immense blocks of men held like animals. And a good friend of mine was the prison psychologist. He had taken one course in psychology at the university. And he became the psychologist for 8,200 men. But it gave me entree into the prison because I'd visit him every weekend. And I wrote a play about that, about how the prison was making people insane. So I was already leaving my family behind.
And then sometime after there was a play about Montezuma, which is leaving the family way behind.
Right. Incidentally, when I look back at that, it's a good instance of naivete, but it also tells you something about what the theater meant at that time. There must have been about 40 characters in that play. I can't remember how many, but there was a lot of people. It never dawned on me that this might be a payroll that would be outsized. I thought it was a perfectly reasonable thing to write a play about a whole empire. It had probably as many characters as one of Shakespeare's historical plays. You know, you look down the list, there's like 40 guys with shields and armor. Because I connected the heroic idea with the theater. And that's all gone now. There's no semblance of it anymore. It's interesting.
But even as you became more a practical man of the theater and realized you couldn't do a play with 40 characters, still you retain that heroic idea, I gather.
Yes, but now I had to find forms that would make it possible in the commercial theater.
Yeah.
We couldn't. We'd never had a national theater. We had the WPA for a while, but that was a short time.
And then you had your first play on Broadway, The Man Who Had All the Luck, which was a huge failure in its time.
Yeah.
Came back finally recently and was a success.
Right.
But
well, it only took 50
only 50 years.
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was an interesting experience too. It was the first time I'd seen anything of mine really played by professional actors. And I couldn't recognize the work at all. It was like somebody else had written it. It wasn't that the production was bad, it was that I visualized action and dialogue in a very pure way so that no human being could speak these lines the way I heard them. And I thought, my God, I can't be in the theater. And I wrote a novel soon after called Focus, because I thought it was a hopeless case.
Right. You really thought about being a novelist as such at that point.
Yeah,
Sure.
that I would just try to work at being a prose writer. The whole idea of going through rehearsals and trying to find actors. See, no actor looked like what I had in mind. No actor sounded like what I thought they should sound like. I was working to make it real, and they were working to make it theatrical, which was no good.
Well, tracing it back a little bit further, your knowledge of the theater before you entered the theater was not enormous.
I knew nothing.
Yeah.
My mother took me to plays, 1 or 2 plays, melodramas, when I was 11, 12 years of age. You know, up Broadway, there were at least 2 theaters that I recall. There may have been more that played plays. They were above 116th Street.
Mm-hmm.
One was Schubert Theater, I think. And they were filled with women during the daytime. The audience was a lot of housewives. And they were, the one I saw was a melodrama about a ship where there was a bomb on board left there by a savage who was black. And the stage moved like a ship. I thought that was just marvelous. And everybody on the play was looking for the bomb. Now, we knew where the bomb was. So the audience would say, no, no, over there, over there. See, they'd tell the actors where to look, but the actors were too stupid. The actors were too stupid to hear us.
Interactive theater, even in those days.
Interactive theater.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember right, there were about 20 people in that audience. It was in the middle of the day, up on 118th Street.
Mm-hmm.
It was a powerful experience, though, to see people on stage talking to each other and not talking to the audience. I'd seen a lot of vaudeville.
Yeah, I was say your primary cultural interests in those days, as I remember, were vaudeville, movies, and certainly books.
Oh, yeah.
Were far more important than live theater.
The vaudeville was terrific.
Your father and you used to go to vaudeville.
He loved vaudeville. He knew all the acts because he traveled a lot as selling his stuff for his company. And he'd seen these acts, you know, they toured the whole country. So he knew them by heart. Mm-hmm. And if they changed anything, he'd say, that's not the way it was in Chicago. And I got to, well, there were some terrific performers. Mm-hmm. And vaudeville in those days.
And in terms of movies, it was Chaplin and Keaton and people like that, I would suppose. Then.
Yeah, but you know, George Burns was on the circuit. Eddie Cantor. I can't remember all the great people that were doing that stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was great fun.
Tell me about your family now. Your father came over here. He was 6 or 7 or 8 by himself. He came over. His family had left him behind in Europe.
It's unbelievable. It will remain so, and it's very mysterious. But his family, he had, I think, 6 brothers and sisters. And the father came over first. They came from Radomyśl, which is a town in Poland near, I believe it's near Krakow. And the father came over to make some money to bring the rest of them, which he did in the space of a year or so. And however, they didn't have enough money for all of them. So they'd send 2, and then he'd make some more money and bring over another 2. Finally, the mother came with the last of the children, but they left him behind. And he was then, I think, about 6. And they left him, I believe, with some uncle who promptly died. And so he was without any relative. And he was very, his memory of it was not very sharp, because you're so young. And I remember talking to him several times about it because it was very mysterious to me. And he said he would sleep with idiots, people who were howling at night, wetting the beds. And I think it finally dawned on me that there must have been some kind of an institution.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's for a fact, but it's the only explanation I have.
Perhaps an orphanage of sorts.
Yes, and they may well have thought he was not quite up to par intellectually.
Yeah. Well, did he think of himself as an orphan at that point, do you think? Is that,
No, he never said that.
yeah. It's curious. In Time Bends, you do suggest that, in fact, there was a deep connection between your father and Marilyn Monroe, your second
Oh,
wife.
yes.
That,
She
that
loved him.
they shared this feeling of
Yes.
dispossession.
He must have had that feeling. He never used the word. But he, as far as he knew, he had been deserted.
Mhm.
Now, at some point, a year or so later, or whenever it was, it could have been longer, they sent money for a ticket. He was put on board a train which went to Hamburg. And a sign was hung on his neck, according to him. Please deliver this boy to a certain ship. Now, on his underwear was pinned his ticket, which of course was worth some money. It may be a comment on that period, because he went across Germany, that nobody stole his ticket. And indeed, he was handed from one stranger to another until he got to the ship. However, in the ship, he was down at the bottom in the steerage. They would feed the families that were coming over from a barrel of herring. Must have been a wonderful smell. And of course, all these families got their food, but he didn't have anybody to dig for him. So he arrived in New York with a big scab on his head, from scurvy, probably,
Mhm.
which took a little while to get rid of. But the thing about it was that, like all suffering of people, he didn't think that was very remarkable.
Mhm.
He thought it was, he got here, and he was met by one of his oldest brother, and they walked from the bottom of Manhattan up to wherever they were living on the Lower East Side.
What language did he speak?
In those days, it would have been the mix of Yiddish and Polish, probably.
Hmm.
He rarely, if ever, I never heard him speak Yiddish, ever.
Mhm.
By the time he was a grown person, he spoke English.
Spoke English.
And whenever there was a Yiddish word, I found him uneasy with it. He wasn't quite at home with it.
Mhm. Was he eager to assimilate?
Yes. I think that was the general rule among a lot of them. He was a blonde, reddish blonde, with blue eyes, a square Germanic head, very tall, and cops used to salute him on the street. He looked like an alderman. He just dressed like a, he wasn't thinking about that, but I think that just his way of dressing was that of a prosperous politician.
Mhm.
He had that look.
And he did eventually become prosperous. He did very well in his business.
He became quite wealthy,
Mhm.
but
Through his own doings.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a-
well, originally the father had a coat company manufacturing coats, and the family was practically packed in there. And my father decided he would break out and go into business for himself, which he did in, I think, about 1923 or 4, something like that. And the old man, for one reason or another, went broke or dissolved the business, so everybody flocked to my father,
Mhm.
all the relatives. In my mother's opinion, they sunk the business.
The relatives sunk the business.
Probably true. And that was the end of it. The whole episode, really, when I look back, it lasted from about 1912 maybe to 1929.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back and talk about your mother, but also to make it very clear that when the Great Depression hit, this was really a great problem for your father, as for everyone
Well,
at the
it
time.
exploded the whole background of the family.
Mhm.
By that time, we were living up in a beautiful neighborhood up in the northern edge of Central Park. They'd long since moved out of the Lower East Side. And
Your father had a chauffeur who would take him to work every day and so on. It was,
he had a chauffeur and this dreadful automobile that kept breaking down like most of them did.
Mhm.
And they lived pretty wonderfully. They were in the theater a lot, saw every musical. I never recall them seeing a play by Eugene O'Neill. It was probably too dark. They loved musicals.
Mhm. Tell me about your mother then.
Well, she was a different line of work. She was born here and went to through high school and was ready to go to college. In fact, she had a scholarship for Hunter when they decided she would get married.
Her family decided that.
Her father. She was, whatever she was, probably 20, 19, something like that. She hated the idea. She wanted to study, but women then obeyed what they were told. She had to agree to this. And she never lost her interest in books. She had no education, though, in literature. She read whatever came to hand. She could read a novel in an evening. She was my first speed reader. And remember it. But she'd read a good book or a piece of junk with the same avidity.
Yeah.
It was all reading matter.
Intellectually, she married down? Is that, would you say? Or?
Well, he could barely read.
Yeah.
He had no, after he'd been here for 6 months, they put him in school when he arrived, and he stayed there 6 or 8 months, and then he was behind a sewing machine
Mhm.
in a sweatshop, and that was it. He had no other education.
How did they meet? Was it an arranged marriage?
Both fathers arranged this. They consulted each other's books to be sure that each was on the same financial level as the other. And they arranged the marriage as they would have in Europe between people who wore royal families. And there was no way out of this.
Mhm.
There was a steamroller. And my father used to joke about it. He'd say in Europe, the shadchan, the guy who arranged the marriages, used to go from one village far away in order to get a perfectly unrelated woman for the man, usually. And they were veiled. And the veil wasn't removed until the wedding was over.
Mhm.
And as he said, there was some surprises.
Sounds more Arabian than Jewish, I would say.
What's that?
Sounds more Arabian than Jewish.
Well,
That's
they're related people. That's why they're fighting all the time.
We'll get to that later.
It's a very similar culture in many ways.
Yeah.
Well, why wouldn't it be? After all, Muhammad was presenting himself as the sacred messenger of God.
There was some suggestion or possibility that the two families were distantly related?
Oh, they wasn't possibility.
It was
they
true.
certainly were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they looked quite alike, except for my mother, oddly enough.
She wasn't tall.
She was tall enough, but she was dark.
Mm-hmm.
She was brown-eyed, brown hair, olive complexion.
Well, was there some story, in fact, you told about when your first child was born, that your father wanted to know whether the child was dark? I mean, there seemed to be
That's right.
what side of the family was this coming
His first question was, I think he said, is he light? Or she,
Mm-hmm.
because my first child was a girl.
Mm-hmm.
Is she light? And that was the first time I'd ever heard that expression.
Mm-hmm.
I said, geez, I don't know. Was she light or dark? The child was a few hours old.
You and your, as I remember now, was your mother's father or grandfather used to go to synagogue together. You sit in his lap, as I remember?
Yeah, I loved that. He, my grandfather, my mother's, well, he would be my great-grandfather.
Great-great-grandfather. Mm-hmm.
Would sit chewing tobacco. He was a great tobacco chewer. And he had a seat next to a open door, which was a fire escape. So that while he was praying, he could spit out the door. Big gobs of stuff going past my head. And it was a very warm feeling, though. He probably, I have no memory of him excepting that I felt good around him.
Mm-hmm.
He seemed to have a lot of vigor. Pick me up, give me a kiss, smell of chewing tobacco. And he was all man. I liked that about him.
Was religion an important factor when you were a child?
You know, I knew nothing about religion excepting that it was wonderful. I didn't know one Bible story, nothing. It was the feeling of all these people being together, being solemn. Something serious was going on, God knows what. I had not a clue as to what this all meant. And it wasn't until I went to college that I started to investigate what it was all about. I knew nothing about anything.
Mm-hmm.
What the holidays meant.
You and your brothers studied for your bar mitzvah, though, didn't you?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
we were, as my father said when I made my bar mitzvah speech, he said, "You put it over."
You put it over?
It was acting. It was all theater. It was all about theater. These actors who could do all the parts but didn't know what they meant.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly didn't.
Yeah.
Hadn't a clue. There was one performance there which I thought was marvelous. They, at one point, the men in the synagogue all put their prayer shawls over their heads, took off their shoes, and danced. And were singing at the same time and praying. And it was the strangest thing. I was also instructed to cover my eyes and not look at this. Of course, I peeked through. That's how I knew what was going on. And I've had more people, rabbis and so on, explaining to me what this was.
What was it?
I don't know. I still don't know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
It was some Orthodox ceremony. And I just loved it. I thought it was a great performance. Scary, because they were dignified men, and suddenly they were covered over with these prayer shawls, and they were dancing.
Well, suddenly, as you say that, I have a picture in my head of the crucible.
Well, you know something that's interesting. When I went up to Salem, Massachusetts in 52, I guess it was, 51. I wasn't sure I could write The Crucible. I'd read a lot, but I hadn't access to original materials yet. I knew they were up in Salem. And while there, I came across woodcuts that were contemporaneous with the event. And one or two of them looked like a synagogue with a leader or minister with a long white beard and long garment and scraggly hair, who was praying over the congregation. I thought, Jesus, this is exactly right out of the synagogue on 112th Street. And of course, going into it deeper, they were all Old Testament Christians. The whole ideology had very little to do with the New Testament. It was all the Old Testament. Their names were all out of the Old Testament. Their ideology was out of the Old Testament. So I felt quite at home with it, and that helped make it possible for me to write it, write the play.
At some point growing up, you were embarrassed by the fact that your father's name was Isidore, Izzy.
That's right.
Made you self-conscious. Why?
I was probably then about, I don't know, probably 8, 9, something like that. I must have become aware at around that time that we were different than the other people on the street, because by this time we were no longer in a ghetto, as you would have been down on Lower East Side, where everybody was Jewish, or almost everybody.
What part of New York was this that you're talking about now?
It was between 5th and Lenox Avenue on 110th Street, which was a wonderful, beautiful neighborhood. And that was a mixture of people. There were a lot of Jews, but there were also other people. And I suppose I must have gotten very defensive about it, because here I was already feeling that I shouldn't say Izzy. Why that happened, I can't recall. It goes back into my earliest years. But it must have been some defensiveness.
By the way, was the name always Miller, or was that an anglicization of?
Was what?
Was the name always Miller?
Yes. Well, I found out later that there were a lot of them in that part of Europe. It was not unusual. How that happened, God knows. I don't know. A lot of the names were German, of course. My grandfather's name, my mother's father's name was Bayer. But my grandmother hated that name for some reason I've never understood. And she had been a servant woman in London for a while for a family named Barnett. So she insisted that he change his name to Barnett, which is what he did.
Well, it certainly sounds very unusual to me that the two families were named Barnett and Miller, which sounds so, well, they don't sound Jewish.
Well, the Barnett was
made up.
Made up was a name, but the Miller part, that's all it was. Now I have to add, my cousin's son went back there to Radomishl 3 or 4 years ago. Just out of curiosity, he became fascinated with his family. And of course, there were hardly any Jews left in Poland anyway. But he managed to investigate the thing, and he found people who remembered that family. And he says that they thought the name had been Mahler, M-A-H-L-E-R. But that they thought that the Mahlers felt it was too German if they were going to go to America. and that they had changed it from Mahler to Miller.
Mhm.
It's all very speculative, though. I'm not sure that any of it makes any sense.
And Gustav Mahler is not a relative of yours. You never know.
Who knows?
Mhm.
Well, of course, Mahler was Jewish, wasn't he?
Yes, of course.
So it could have been that that was the name.
Yeah. Did you feel any anti-Semitism at all as a boy and a young man?
I never was. I never felt that. No,
Mhm.
when I was growing up. I should say that I went to school on 111th Street. There's a school there; it's still there. And there were a lot of Italian kids, and they would gang up on us periodically. But it really had nothing to do with being Jewish. It had to do with not being Italian.
Right.
And they would, you know, rob your skates and so on.
Mhm.
But I'm sure they victimized some other people too.
Yeah. The feeling that I get, particularly from Time Bends, is that you did.
Gentlemen, will you just stop for 1 second for technical reason? Yeah. You know, just okay?
How we
We've
doing?
already gone an hour.
Just like that. That's
You know? Look good? Right? Everyone check their balance for a second? Something you have to look first.
I had a great time writing that story.
Did you?
The last one. Laughing all the way.
Where'd that idea come from? That's it.
It just hit me one day. Actually, it was a idea I had 5, 6 years ago. I forgot completely about it. And my assistant, I told her to put together some, I have a lot of journals, and we were transferring material from one journal to another. And she's the one that said, you ought to write that, because I just had like 3 lines in the journal,
Mhm.
and I'd totally forgotten about it. I thought, gee, that's a hell of an idea I had.
You've had several New Yorker now. There was one before, I remember.
Yeah.
That's good.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. I wanted to talk more about about fiction and the theater. And I went back to a collection of stories that you had in, I think it was back in 1966. And you said about the short story, it offers a vessel for those feelings and tales which, unelaborated, are truer, and yet for one reason or another do not belong on a stage. And you continue, from time to time there is an urge not to speed up and condense events and character development, which is what one does in a play, but to hold them frozen and to see things isolated in stillness, which I think is the great strength of a good short story. And the phrase that lingered with me, of course, was isolated in stillness. You believe that in '66? Probably still today as well?
I think so, yeah. You know, on the stage, at least in my kind of theater, the thing has to move. It's a dynamic form. It's not like a painting. It's not like anything else. Ideally, every word in the play ought to be doing some work in advancing something, whether it be the atmosphere, or it be the theme, or the character development, or whatever. In a story, it's more like painting to me. You disturb the material far less. There's a vision, which can be painted as it was without distortion due to the fact that you have to make this thing move. Now, that doesn't mean that all stories are that way, but for me, that's what a story does.
Your great strength in a play, of course, is writing dialogue, and yet when you write stories, dialogue is not the first element that you think about.
Dialogue in the story can, in some stories, it can be terrifically important. But for me, the dialogue is feeding into that image.
Mm-hmm.
It's helping to create that image. And the story is about that image. It's possibly a weird way of looking at it, but
Yeah.
it makes sense to me.
Was there a time when you were writing plays when you suddenly realized that you could write dialogue?
That happened very early on. When I first attempted to write a play in Ann Arbor, and I wrote a scene, I can even remember it now, and it seemed quite wonderful to me that with no prose, no description, I could make things seem real. And that was a terrific discovery, that simply by having people talk to each other, you could get a sense of place and of character with no interference whatsoever from the instruction that's in prose. Mm-hmm. And that is a terrific power in that, a sense of great power.
It's also clear that this is not overheard dialogue. You're not, for instance, sitting in a cafe transcribing what you hear.
Not at all. Yeah. It's very composed. Mm-hmm. It's very, very deeply edited before I even put it down. Mm-hmm. As I say, the best dialogue is transformative in the sense that each line should, if you can manage it, advance something, be it the characterization or the painting of the place or the time or the theme or whatever. You can't horse around with empty words or half-realized lines. The best plays have that about them. If you read, well, there's some prose that does that. Dostoevsky does that. You get the feeling that he has squeezed out of every description anything that was not quite important, that it's very deeply edited. I once had years and years ago, I was talking to a poet who was arguing with me about that. And he was also an editor. And he said, well, if you look at Dostoevsky, you see passages where the atmosphere is the main thing. And this isn't advancing any characterization of any kind, or the story even. I said, well, let's pick one. And I think it was Brothers Karamazov. He remembered some section which he thought was particularly telling and which was poetic. It was not dramatic. I said, well, let's find it. Well, we found it. An invading army reading that passage could locate every house on every street. The way the lane turned, the way it went up a little hill and down. Mm-hmm. A geographer reading this thing would have no problem drawing a diagram of the whole town. I said, this is the most definite kind of writing imaginable, but it creates a picture which is poetic. Mm-hmm. So it's not just in the theater, but in the theater it's preeminently that way.
Speaking of editing, though, do your plays go through much self-editing? And let's if we can zero in on Death of a Salesman. Did it come out as you wrote it? Did you have to
Not
rewrite
really.
it many?
You know, I started writing that play when I was in college. Now, I wrote the play in 1948, I guess. And I graduated from the university 10 years earlier. Sometime, probably when I was a senior, maybe in 1938, I had started to write a play about that family. I gave it up because I didn't know how to go on with it. And I forgot about it. I forgot about it so totally that when I started to write Death of a Salesman, I considered that this was a completely new work. It was only 10 years after that, in the 60s really, that I was cleaning out some drawers and stuff, and I found this notebook, which dated back to my college years. I opened a notebook, and there's the beginning of this Death of a Salesman. So it had been rattling around in my head for at least a decade before I actually wrote it. Now, when I started to write it, it did pour out, but I was still doing a hell of a lot of changing and editing before I ever came to a final script.
First line was first line?
Willie, you came back.
You came back, right.
Well, before I got to that, there was a lot of other stuff that I had to get rid of.
Uh-huh.
Because that's the beginning of the beginning of the end. He came back. A salesman who comes back the same day he left is in trouble.
And Willie is very much in trouble.
And he's in trouble. Yeah.
Now, Willie was based on a friend of the family.
He was roughly, there's so many differences, but it's when I wrote it, it was based upon an uncle of mine,
Manny, is that his name?
Manny Newman,
Mm-hmm.
who lived 2 or 3 blocks from us in Brooklyn. And once I had the sound of him, everything changed. I mean, I then could invent whatever I needed to invent, because I could put him anywhere, and he would start talking. And it was him. He was an absurd little man. You couldn't believe most of what he said. But you had to love him. And that was, I think, the heart of the whole matter.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember writing the play?
Well, you know, I built a little building first, which now that I look back at it, I sort of marvel at it. All that energy. I owned this house in Connecticut, 2 hours away from New York. And I'm not quite sure why I felt I had to have a new building to build this, to write this play in. But I love carpentry, and I spent probably a couple of weeks. My family was in Brooklyn, my wife and children. But I stayed up there and I invented this building, which is 8 by 10, and it's still there. It's occupied by a writer.
Willie Loman's house.
Willie Loman's house. And finally, when I got the roof on it, and I had no more excuse not to be writing a play, I never did get to paint the interior. I can remember the first couple of hours. It just seemed like a big ocean that I could cross.
Were you writing in longhand or typing?
I had a Corona typewriter, great typewriter.
A standard large typewriter?
No, it was a portable.
Portable.
You had to be strong. You had to hit the keys, you know. And it was just great to work there.
Mm-hmm.
It still would be. It's up on a little mound, little hill. And I don't know, I suppose I wanted my own shelter, a way that I invented, that was not part of this world.
As you were writing it, could you envision the play on stage?
Yes. You know, the play in many ways was an invention. It's now become such a standard thing that you don't think about it in those terms. The invention was that the way I visualize it anyway, was that he was in two places at the same time, which is the way we think, really. Meaning that while you're saying one thing, you can be thinking of things that remind you of. And while he's talking, another line of action is taking place in his head. But in his case, he says it. And this is what seems so absurd about him. I'll give you an example. He wants something to eat in the first scene. And Linda says, oh, I have some American type cheese. It's a new American type cheese. It's whipped. And that goes by, and they talk about some other stuff. And about 20 lines later, absolutely, without connection of what they're talking about, he suddenly says, how can they whip cheese? Well, this is typical of that method, in his case. He is expressing his subconscious or semi-conscious life all the time.
You didn't think of it as a realistic play. I mean, as from the original title referred to his head.
It never was.
Yeah.
Of course, since he is a salesman and this country lives on selling, and the whole world does now, he became typified as a symbol of some sort of the whole society. But that wasn't really the way I was thinking. I was thinking of a detailed human being who turned out to be what he turned out to be. But the concentration was on what he was doing with his head, not some social program.
Manny Newman to Willie Loman. Newman, Loman.
However, that's true, but the name Loman always mystified me because I never knew anybody by the name Loman, although it's a name that people have. About, I don't know, 10 years after I wrote the play, I was walking down 42nd Street, when you could still walk down 42nd Street. Well, it's better now, I guess, but for a while it was a barbarity. And I saw this old movie house, which I think has now been retransformed into a theater. And the last will of Dr. Mabuse was playing, Fritz Lang's movie. And I had seen that picture probably in the early 40s, which would then be 20 years before this event, this moment. And I thought, geez, I wonder, that picture really landed on me. And I thought I'll go and see a few minutes of it. I went in. And just quickly, now mind you, Salesman was already written 10 years before this moment. And the story of Mabuse is that mysterious fires are happening all over Paris. And the detective, whose name is Loman, is trying to figure out why. And the problem is that there doesn't seem to be any profit to anybody. Nobody's claiming insurance. They can't find anything that was burned up that somebody would want to disguise or get rid of. So he goes to this psychiatrist, famous Parisian psychiatrist who lives out in the country, describes what's happening, and the psychiatrist says, "You're looking in the wrong way. This has nothing to do with profit. These are people who want to destroy the society." Of course, it turns out the psychiatrist is the leader of this band. The detective assigns an assistant to track down people who, well, his whole police force is involved in watching crowds who are watching fires. Because if they can see that there are the same guys watching different fires, they may get a clue. And indeed, this particular detective sees the same guy at 3 different fires. So he follows him. And it's night, and he follows him into a printing plant, a gigantic printing plant in the middle of Paris. And it's marvelously spooky, and he tracks him into the guy opens a door in a wall, goes down the stairs, and the detective follows him, where they find an auditorium. And the auditorium is empty except for about 6 people. But they're not seated together. One looks like a banker, another one looks like a chauffeur, another one looks like a prostitute, another one looks like a baker. And they're all facing this drawn curtain on a stage. And now the voice comes from the curtain saying, "Okay, on tomorrow morning, we are going to set fire to the museum on whatever street, and bring gasoline," and so. And the detective rushes the stage, parts the curtain, and there's a phonograph record. He is then chased, and he ends up in a tiny office, which has the light on. And he picks up the phone to report to the chief, whose name is Lohman. And he says, "Lohman? Lohman!" Suddenly the light goes out. And he's crying out, "Lohman!" The next shot, he's in an insane asylum. He's been scared out of his wits, and he's got his empty hand up to his face saying, "Lohman? Lohman?" I watched that and I thought, that's where the name came from. There's a man calling for help that never comes.
Mm-hmm. So you owe it all to Fritz Lang, right?
Owe it all to Fritz Lang.
Mm-hmm.
The marvelous movie. But I found out instantly, I wanted to get the movie again. He had about 8 versions, which were dreadful. That version was wonderful.
Does Willy Loman talk to you?
Not anymore.
He used to, though, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. I used to hear him.
After the play was written?
I didn't have time to listen after the play, but during the play,
During the
yeah.
play. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to hear his voice. See, people don't seem to be aware of how funny that play is. I laughed a lot when I was writing it. For example, funny in a terrible way. He goes to his boss in that scene where he wants to get a raise and ends up being fired. And he explains to him what the problem is in selling nowadays. Whereas in the old days, people had respect and they had relationships with each other. He and buyers, he and other salesmen. Everything now is cut and dried. There's no chance to bring friendship to bear is the way he puts it. You see, they don't know me anymore. And the boss says, well, that's just the thing, Willie. But you see, when I wrote They Don't Know Me Anymore, I thought, see, he just hung himself. And he does that throughout the play.
Laughter comes through the irony of situations like that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And in one way or another, he is providing the evidence why he cannot break out of this.
And you laughed while you were writing it.
Laugh, you know, you laugh with tears in your eyes. It's just crazy.
Mhm. Is Willie Loman Jewish?
Accepting, yes, but they were completely isolated from any Jewish society, but totally, in a way that I haven't found very often in my life. They came actually from an upstate New York town where the kids had been raised, and where there were no Jews. And he ran a little shoe store. And
This is Manny Newman or Willie Loman?
yeah, Manny Newman.
Manny Newman.
And he simply had no Jewish identity
Mhm.
that I haven't discovered.
Right. And it doesn't matter with Willie whether one considers him Jewish or not? Not an important factor?
Apparently not.
Hmm.
Turns out he's Swedish, he's Chinese,
He's played around the world, Japanese, everything. right?
Japanese.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You know, I was, this is very recent. The Japanese delegation came to see me, and a youngish man, maybe 40 years old, said, I'm going to play Willie Loman in Tokyo. He said, you know, the play is on now for 40 years. I said, well, I heard about that. He says, my father used to be Willie Loman, I used to be Biff. And now I'm going to be, he's retiring. And the old man was there. And he must have been 80. But he was still hanging on, playing Willie. So it turns out it didn't matter.
Some of the best actors that I've seen play Willie have in fact been Jewish.
Here,
Here.
yeah, well, of course. Well, George Scott played it too.
That's true.
And
Lee Cobb was Jewish.
Freddie March played it in
Yeah.
the movie.
Lee
Cobb was Jewish.
was Jewish, and Dustin Hoffman.
Dustin, yeah.
Mhm.
There have been a number who weren't.
Right. But to go over it once more, it is not an important factor in Willie's life, or at least in the life of the play, let's say.
It didn't, had it been, I would have written it that way.
Mhm.
It
Okay.
just never existed. There would have been a distortion, put it that way, to labor that point. It simply didn't exist.
Yeah. Well, at some point, I think there's a parallel in Harold Pinter's The Homecoming, which also was inspired by a Jewish family, and yet it's never a factor in when you see the play. This is not part of his writing.
I mean, if you're going to make that the point, then you can make that the point.
Mhm.
I mean, I have written about Jews
Right.
who are Jews. But if that isn't the point of the thing, then why am I going to label everybody a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew,
Mhm.
or whatever?
Yeah. But one major point of the play is what happens to people like that after the Depression. What?
That was the point.
Mhm.
Yes, and it would have been a disservice to that had he been labeled Jewish.
Mhm.
I think, especially at that time,
Yeah.
it simply didn't seem to add anything.
Well, certainly in the end, how you wrote it added to the universality of the play, as you say, that it's been done around the world in different languages by different people. That it has achieved a dimension beyond the play itself. Do you remember when you finished Death of a Salesman? Great elation. You ran outside of the little building and. What was it like?
Well, I was just elated, but full of doubts.
Why doubts?
Well, you see, that play had a method in it that I wasn't sure anybody but me would understand. The staging of it, him going in and out of the present. This hadn't been done before, that I knew of, and I don't think it had been done before. And when I sent it to Kazan, I fully was prepared for him to say, I don't understand it. And indeed, he certainly did understand it. But when they were raising money for the production, one of the people they sent it to was a considerable director, Logan. Now, Logan had put money in All My Sons. And blind, here I was with another play, and Kazan also directed All My Sons. So he put down $1,000, which was a lot of money in those days. The whole budget was $30,000 maybe. He read the play and took back $500. Asked why, he says, nobody's going to understand this. Where is he? In what part of his brain are we to understand he's talking from? And this is what I had feared was going to happen. But luckily, Kazan understood it.
After several days, Kazan did call back and say it was a terrific play. I mean, it was clear from the start that he really wanted to do it.
Well, Kazan's first word, I'll never forget, he says, God, it's so sad.
Which must have given you pause right there. Yeah.
Well, I was happy. He said, I couldn't read the end of it. He says, I was just weeping. And, which is the way it should have been. It reached him.
Yeah.
But then a lot of people were put off. And I remember that in the staging of it, great care was taken that we should understand when he was going back in his life. So that, since he refers to a big tree outside the building, outside the house, they projected leaves all over the house to indicate that they were going back in time. And he stepped through a wall which otherwise we should imagine was there. The floor of that kitchen was 6 inches higher than the regular floor. In the realistic present scenes, they observed that as a wall. Whenever he had to go out of the present, he had stepped through that wall. That was another strategy, to tell them that we were no longer in the present. And of course, in the acting, it had to be different. He had to act younger, which Lee Cobb was magnificent doing. He just took on different energy.
Could you tell a story about Lee Cobb, about the casting? I mean, I realize that initially you thought of him as a small man, as a shrimp, as it were, and then finally, after thinking about several other actors, Lee J. Cobb, who was larger than small, and also quite young at the time,
36.
was cast as Willie Loman. If you could tell the story, which I
Well, Kazan and he had been in the group theater together, and Lee was quite a large man, and I resisted this for a while until we had exhausted all the small actors in New York, and it became apparent that the part was bigger than these guys. They sounded like pipsqueaks playing Macbeth. You couldn't do it. It trivialized the whole thing. So we needed some heroic size. And Kazan dreamed up Lee, whom I didn't know, but I had seen him on stage. And Lee was in California, and he had a pilot's license. And he rented he had a multi-engine plane license. I think he'd been in the Air Force. And he flew himself into New York and announced, "This is my part." It soon became apparent that it was his part. It was his part, but I was a little nervous when I met him. Until I saw him laugh. He came to my house in Brooklyn Heights, and my son, who was then about 3 or 4, did something funny, and Lee laughed. And the pain in that laughter was so clear, and I thought, he could do this part.
Well, at the early days rehearsal, he could not do the part.
For 10 days, he did nothing but sit there like a walrus. And we were then getting desperate, because Kazan finally admitted he'd used up all his strategies, and we might have to get somebody else. Because there was no way to go on. The rest of the cast knew their roles. They were all ready to go. He wasn't playing a single scene. He was muttering, walking around like an idiot. And then one afternoon, which I will never forget, the line was, he says to his wife, there are more people now, and that's why the competition is terrible in business. And also why the neighborhood is deteriorated, because it's getting crowded, whereas before it was more open, the old Brooklyn. And she says, I don't think there's more people, and she never gets to finish the sentence. He suddenly stood up and roared out, "There are more people now." And all of us sitting out there, Kazan and me and the producer and Jimmy Proctor, who was the press guy, we all woke up. And in about 10 minutes, we were devastated. He was fantastic. It was just magic. He was just, you forgot you were in a theater, you forgot you were anywhere. He controlled the whole situation. It was, I've never seen that in my life.
And you saw that, like the whole house and the whole play was.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, we had no set. It was an empty stage. But he made the set happen.
How did the other actors react to that? Was it
they
evident?
were so happy.
Yeah.
They then went up 6 notches because they'd been dragging him around psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
They've been trying to get him interested in acting. But he was creating something that he had to create. And we had sort of given up on him. But it was a moment, it was a transfixing. Jimmy Proctor was sobbing like a baby, trying not to make any noise. And he had a handkerchief over his face and was simply helpless. And when the act finished, he simply blubbered all over the place. It wasn't the play necessarily. It was he'd been to a lot of rehearsals and he had worried along with the rest of it. It was this transformation of this man into a character that was simply miraculous.
Were you crying as well?
No, I was laughing.
I know.
I was very moved by it.
Yeah.
But I was immensely relieved. I was flying.
Well, the play was discovered. That was it.
That's the day that we knew we had a play.
Yeah.
And I've never seen that before,
Mhm.
or since. He made that man happen.
And then when it opened, he kept it up. I mean, he did not lose
Yes,
it.
until after about, he only played it for some months. I don't remember now how long. 4 months maybe. And of course, we were no longer in theater. Kazan had gone off to make a film. And I went by one day to look in, and the play was now about 10 minutes longer, because he had redirected the actors.
Cobb had read it.
And simply taken twice as long to say everything. And destroyed his performance, really, but nobody knew, except us. And I went back and I talked to him, and he denied he was doing anything different. So he finally got out of it.
Now, the other major moment of that play, of course, was the opening night. So even though you knew that Cobb could do it.
Well, of course, we had played in Philadelphia by then.
Mm-hmm.
And the Philadelphia performances were simply revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. But still, New Yorkers really didn't know it until it
No.
came in.
And,
All they knew was the Death of a Salesman. What? That's not a selling title.
well,
That's-
a couple of people had come to Philadelphia, of all places, like Lada Lenya, and I can't remember, well, some actors from Europe especially, some of the Germans, and they knew what it was. And I remember talking to her about it. She says, "This is the best play I've ever seen in my life." I thought, well, that's pretty good. So we got to New York. We were pretty sure about it,
But I would think there would have been a little bit of edginess about New York, and I remember that there's a classic New York Times story when Sam Zolotow, who used to write the theatrical column for the Times, before the play came in, he supposedly called you and had the title, and he said, as all the city room was listening, because Sam always shouted into the telephone, he said, "Arthur, what's that play about?" Long pause. "About a salesman who dies?" And would have been a number of New Yorkers, despite the fact that you had a hit before, had All My Sons, still would have been somewhat dubious about the success of the play.
More than dubious.
Okay.
It was. See, the choice of the title was a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It was meant as a challenge, in fact. See, we had Death in the Archbishop, Willa Cather's book. I think it was Willa Cather.
That's right. Death Takes a Holiday.
Death Takes a Holiday.
Another Broadway success.
But to put death with a salesman was ludicrous. How could you elevate a salesman to this kind of nobility? He croaks, but he doesn't. I mean, the salesman hardly deserves a funeral. So
It's also giving away the ending, of course.
and of course, I didn't want them to think that he was going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another way of challenging them, to lift the suspense off. That don't wait for him to come out of this. But when we opened, Lee made one error. I'll never forget that one. He's supposed, toward the end, he's supposed to say, referring to an old salesman, he says, Dave Singelman. And he'd come in to the Boston, on the Boston Railroad, it's supposed to be the New Haven and Hartford Railroad. He'd say, New Haven and Haven Railroad. I thought, here goes the whole show. And I thought they'd burst out laughing, because this audience certainly knew the New Haven and Hartford Railroad. There wasn't a sound. Of course, they were with him.
Mm-hmm.
But The Broadway part of it was wonderful. The curtain came down. Nobody moved.
Were you sitting in the audience?
Sitting in the back on the stairs with Kazan. Nobody moved for, it seemed like 5 minutes. It couldn't have been, but it seemed that way. And then the place came apart. They were yelling and shouting, and people were snuffling, and people were hysterical and so on. And gradually they dispersed, but they were like at some kind of a funeral. And I went backstage to kiss the actors and spent a little time there. Lucille Ball was there, Desi Arnaz. And he turned to me and he said, "You wrote that?" And so on. And then I started to get thirsty. I thought, I got to get a drink of water or something. I left the dressing rooms, went on stage, and there, magically, was a banquet table the width of the stage, about 35 feet, covered with silverware, tureens of food, settings for 25 people. I thought, what the hell is this? Isn't this wonderful? The management, I figured, is going to have a dinner now for us. And I saw this bucket of ice with a bottle of champagne, and there were Louis Sherry waiters in uniform, red uniform, with braid on their shoulders. They were fussing around. And I went over to the champagne bottle and picked it up, and this waiter came running over. He says, "No, this is a dinner." I said, "Well, I'm the author of this play." He says, it's for the Mr. Dowling, who owned the theater. I thought, well, it's not possible then. Of course, in about 10 minutes, those seats were occupied by very elegant people. Probably 15 couples in evening dress, very elegantly done up. And we were not allowed on stage. That was my initiation into Broadway, the real Broadway.
Now, this was the old-fashioned opening night. Critics ran back to their offices, wrote their reviews, usually about an hour's time.
And Sam Zolotow,
Brooks Atkinson was writing the review for the Times at
yeah,
that time.
Jimmy Proctor called the Times because he could get the news quicker. And he handed me the phone, Jimmy did. And there was Sam Zolotow, who you could hear the typewriters. Those days there were typewriters. And Sam Zolotow was whispering. He was reading the review as Atkinson was writing it. And whispering into the phone the review to me. Isn't that wonderful?
And it was filled with lavish praise of
Oh, yeah.
every possible sort.
You couldn't ask any more. But I remember he had a real New York accent. And he was awed. You could hear the awe in his voice as he...
Well, that moment changed your life.
Well, substantially, sure. Sure. Well, the play had opened up a lot of things for me, but also for the actors, the audience. I think it added a perspective as to what you could do on stage. And in a way it still does, I think. Because it was a massive subject. It was really American society. But it was from the inside, not a tract.
Well, some playwrights might have rested right there.
Well, I felt that now I had the license to do anything. And what I wanted to do was to write a play where nobody would cry.
That bothered you, that people were crying at...
Yeah, I felt
Louis
that they
Lohman.
weren't getting the point.
But tears are part of the play, though.
Yeah, well, of course, I'm old now, and I understand that. I was young and angry then. But I wanted to write a tougher play.
How old were you then? Now you were...
30. Well, I was born in 1915, and that was 49.
Mm-hmm.
I can't add that quickly. Or subtract, rather. 34.
34 years old. Top of the world. Top of Broadway.
I felt very old. I thought, that's a real old age. Yeah. It changed everything because I now had, for a while, the audience was on my side.
Mm-hmm.
Even some of the critics.
I want to go back to the earlier play briefly, to All My Sons, which also was a success and won prizes. Was not the great success that Death of a Salesman was in its time. But so one very interesting element to that play was that soon after it became a success on Broadway.
Sorry, Mr. Rizzo, can we wait for the siren to stop? There's a ambulance going by.
Okay.
Okay, we can just take the question from the back.
All My Sons was a success on Broadway, not as big a success as Death of a Salesman, but still a success. And I was always interested in the fact that soon after it opened and became a success, you went out to look for a job. You decided you wanted to have a day job, so to speak. Why?
Well, it wasn't, see, I was getting royalties from the play, and I was making more money than I ever had in my life, so it wasn't for the money. I feared that I would get separated from mankind by becoming a theater person, which I didn't want to be. So I thought, I've got to go out and mix with regular people. So I went to the New York State Employment Service, and I took the first job they offered, which was in a box factory in Long Island City. And there they were, these people who were dutifully filling, in those days there used to be wooden boxes with spaces in them for beer bottles. So you were filling these spaces with these cross-hatched pieces of wood. I did that for 8 hours. I resolved to come back the next day. I think I stayed there about 3 days. Couldn't make it.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I'm different.
And indeed you were.
And it was silly to pretend that I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to try it, whatever it is. And
was part of it shunning the success of it?
yeah, I felt a little embarrassed by it. I was very shy.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't bear the idea of being noticed, although that's what I wanted to be, is noticed. But I wished I could send out somebody to do that for me.
Yeah. A real contradiction there. I mean, you're in a very public art. Necessarily, that's part of it.
Yeah, my envy has always been, what's a writer that lived in Mexico? He wrote,
Yes.
he was German, a very mysterious man. And his name will come to me maybe. Although we're not sure what his name was, but his pen name. Anyway, he vanished into the jungles. He would issue a novel every couple of years. That's what I'd love to have done.
Really?
But of course, you can't do plays like that. You got to be around to argue with the actors. Just vanish and then emit one of these works occasionally.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly easier for a novelist or, I mean, a fiction writer of any sort to do that. For a playwright, as I say, it's a public
Playwright's
art.
got to be mixed up in the theater,
Yeah.
one way or another.
Mhm.
It's just part of the trade.
Mhm. No, it's true of actors as well. So many of them will try to avoid the spotlight, but on the other hand, they're in the spotlight.
Well, it seems to trivialize everything, because there's always they've got to write it so that it's exciting and makes some sense. And the fact is, most of your life doesn't make any sense, and it's not very exciting.
Mhm. I still feel kind of temporary about myself, says Willie Loman. And you said, summed up by my own condition then and throughout my life. That phrase. You said you were 20 before you learned how to be 15, 30 before you knew what it meant to be 20. And you said, at this point, now at 72, I have to stop myself from thinking like a man of 50 who has plenty of time ahead. Well, now you're 87.
I'm still afflicted by the same delusion. I have I guess, a illusion that there is infinite amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Less so now because I've got aches and pains, and, you know, the usual afflictions of old age. I don't see as well, don't hear as well. I still eat as well. That's a problem. And it's tougher now to maintain that illusion. In fact, I think very often now of disappearing.
Disappearing?
Yeah, of death.
Mm. What do you think about it?
Well, I'm 87. You don't live too much longer. And then I look around at all the stuff people are going to have to dispose of that I've accumulated in my house in the country. And I think, thank God, I won't be here to have that problem.
Our friend Al Hirschfeld is turning 100 this year. Still drawing at the top of his form.
Marvelous, huh?
Mm.
And he seems perfectly happy about it.
Yes, well, he found his calling in life and kept doing it. And that,
Yeah.
I mean, it's your work that's made you the
Yeah.
happy. Are you a happy man?
Excuse me?
Are you a happy man? Would you say?
I'm happy when I'm working. And if I'm not working, I'm miserable. It's like you're not functioning. You're vegetating. Have no focus. You sense time passing without being able to grab it by the forelock, as the saying goes. And you can't stop it. It's going to go. And I'm still obsessed with trying to do something. So I write a short story instead of a play. But I've been working on a play for change, and I'm not sure I'll ever get to finish it, but it's interesting.
Could you talk about it?
I better not. If I talk about it, it puts a curse on it. It no longer belongs to me.
Okay. Are you often not working?
Seems to me I'm not working most of the time. But then when I look back, I realize I'm working all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just not writing all the time.
But you're thinking about right.
Thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a kind of obsessive feeling that I've got to develop something out of something else. It's you're transforming things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but think what a wonderful idea this is, which I'm not going to use. or a title or something.
But you still have things you want to say that you haven't said before.
I have more things to say now than I ever had,
Okay.
I think. Because, and it gets in a way easier to say them, because I have no fear whatsoever about saying anything. No anxiety about saying anything. But getting to find the form for it, to develop a full-blown story is just the same problem it always is.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't get any easier.
Well, your most recent play, Resurrection Blues, is about the supposed return of a Messiah,
Yeah.
of the Messiah,
Right.
to Earth, and it's a comedy. Why a comedy?
Because it's absurd. The whole idea is absurd. And unfortunately, though, it was done at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, and I thought the production was pretty good, and the audience was marvelous. You know, it's a 12 or 1,300 seat theater, and they were practically full up all the time, which they don't do very often now. But I can't get a production of that play here. Nobody wants to do it.
It doesn't matter that you're Arthur Miller.
No. The money there's too much money. Cost, I don't know, it probably cost $1 million to put it on,
Sure.
I suppose.
Yeah.
And there's no music in it. There is music in the background, beautiful music, but it's not a musical. So I think that, you know, the big theater, the heroic theater, is probably dead for the time being.
Except that's the kind of theater you still want to write for, though.
I can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
It's I've written small plays with 4 or 5 people in them, but I recognize that they're small plays. This is not the full-blown cannon blowing off, and because we don't have either the money. The money is the main thing. The thing has to earn what, $500,000 a week in order to stay there in the theater. And how much art, dramatic art, is there that could do that? I don't think Chekhov could do it. I don't think Ibsen could do it for more than a couple of weeks. Who could do it?
They would probably say to Chekhov, too many characters.
Too many characters. What do you need all that stuff for? You can't do O'Neill, excepting for a very short engagement. Run out of people. And who's there to substitute for that? So it's a totally different line of work than it was when I came into it.
But you're still doing it. Yeah.
I figure that someday it may change. I do think it will. I don't know how, but I think you can't lose an idea like that forever. See, our politics, our society is, the implications are heroic, they're tremendous. I mean, you get a guy like Bush in office, and you realize that this office is for a gigantic person. And you realize it more because he's so little. And how are you going to write about that on a kitchen sink, in a kitchen sink way? You can, but it would be the kitchen sink, when what you got is a big organ there. We are confronted with gigantic possibilities, and we are pygmies trying to handle them. It's terrible. It's a See, Tony Kushner realized it. He tried to meet the problem on its own level in that play.
Angels in America.
Angels in America. Yes.
Well, also in the next play, Hombre de Cabo, too, again, dealing with
haven't seen
major themes.
Yeah. But he is trying to find the bigness of it all.
But I would say that fewer playwrights are trying today.
I don't see any sign of it.
Mhm.
They've snuggled into a kind of, see, these little theaters help that along. You get a 50, 60 seat theater, even a 100 seat theater. You can't play that kind of music. I mean, you put the Ninth Symphony in some grocery store, it's not possible. It sounds ridiculous.
Mhm.
Why all that noise when you could have a three-piece band? It'd be much better.
On the other hand, with the definite exception of The Crucible, I've seen many of your plays in smaller situations, and they seem to work equally well, whether it's a tiny off-Broadway theater or a large Broadway house.
Well, they wouldn't have started there, though.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think. You know, you get they don't have the financial ability to do that.
Mm.
If you have 100 seats, you've got that much income from 100 seats. And to try to attract a Lee Cobb into that situation, not easy.
When I said that, I was thinking partly, I recently saw an absolutely wonderful production of The Price in London in a tiny theater. Could have been more than maybe 100, maybe 200 seats at the most.
They're moving that to the West End.
They're moving it to a large theater.
Yeah.
Comes with success.
The Price can be done because Price got 4 people in it.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's a quartet. That's not a symphony. And you could do it with there.
But you think of it as one of your major plays, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's another production which I understand is terrific in Australia. They were raving about it. Yeah, we had a terrific production in New York with Bob Dishy and
Mm-hmm.
the guys. But they threw it out of the theater finally. It was making money because they found something that made more money.
Well, also in the original production with David Burns, and even, I remember there was one with Eli Wallach that was very good. It's been done
Oh, yeah.
done a
Eli
lot.
was terrific.
Solomon, one of your principal
He's
Jewish characters. He's Jewish.
Sorry, gentlemen, we're going to have to switch tapes. We need a few minutes to break.
Okay. How are we doing?
12:30. We've gone now several days